Operation Weserübung was the German invasion of Norway and Denmark in 1940. Norway had a major importance for the Germans because its port Narvik was used to transport vital Swedish iron ore during the winter, since Baltic seaports like Luleå could freeze up. Additionally, the Norwegian coastal waters allowed German ships, especially merchant ships, a safer route into the Atlantic than other routes. Also, the control of Norway would allow the Germans to put pressure on Sweden, which would likely concede to most demands. Due to the importance of Norway, both the Allies and the Germans had several plans surrounding Norway and Sweden, but more on that later. On the 7th of April 1940, German squadrons with troops on board launched towards Trondheim and Narvik. The force consisted of the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, a heavy cruiser, and 14 destroyers. Although the visibility was limited, British recon planes detected the force and it was attacked by 35 aircraft, yet without scoring any hits. Since the British weren't aware of the German operation beforehand, it took the British forces until a night to arrive in full force. On the 8th of April in the morning, the first encounter happened between the destroyer HMS Glowworm and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. Both decided to ram each other, which sank the Glowworm and damaged the Hipper. On the 9th of April there was a short skirmish between the battlecruiser Renown and the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, in which both sides scored some hits but ultimately withdrew. At different points in time, German troop landings began. German destroyer landed troops at Ramnes, Hemnes and near Narvik. During the approach towards Narvik, 2 Norwegian ships tried to stop the Germans, but were sunk after short engagements. The German mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, took control of Narvik without a fight. The city of Trondheim was taken by troops from the Hipper and her escorts. In this case, there was a brief exchange with the coastal batteries without significant damage. Although the city could be taken without a fight, some of the batteries and airfield couldn't be secured immediately. The attack on Bergen was similar. In this case, the coastal batteries scored several hits. Yet with the support of the Luftwaffe, the batteries were captured and the city taken without resistance. The airfield at Stavanger was first attacked by air. Then airborne and air transported troops continued the attack. Additionally, more troops were brought in by 4 ships, of which 1 transport ship was sunk by a Norwegian torpedo boat. The airfield could be secured. Meanwhile at Egersund, minesweepers landed troops to take control of the signaling station there. At Kristiansand, the Kriegsmarine had less luck. It took 3 attempts due to poor weather and strong resistance from the coastal batteries, which was finally broken with the help of the Luftwaffe. For the attack on the capital Oslo, the Germans used a considerable force consisting of the heavy cruiser Blücher, the Panzerschiff Lützow, a light cruiser and many smaller vessels. Although the squadron entered the Oslo fort during the cover of darkness, the Norwegian defensives detected them and opened fire. Several hits were scored and the Blücher was hit by 2 torpedoes that sank her. The other ships turned around and landed troops to reach Oslo by land. Similarly, the airborne operations against Oslo had also problems due to bad visibility and resistance. Nevertheless, after ground attacks, the airfield could be taken and several air-landed companies took control of the capital. The initial movements of the Kriegsmarine had the element of surprise, but that was lost over the course of 9th of April, and the Allies, most notably the Royal Navy, engaged. Near Kristiansand, the light cruiser Karlsruhe was hit by 2 torpedoes from a submarine and had to be scuttled. The Panzerschiff Lützow was also hit by a torpedo from a submarine and so severely damaged that it had to be towed back to Germany. On the 10th of April near Bergen, the already damaged light cruiser Königsberg was hit by bombs and sunk. Due to delayed refueling operations, 10 German destroyers were still in Narvik. Although 4 U-boats covered the entry to the fort, 5 British destroyers bypassed them and surprised the German destroyers, sinking 2 of them and losing 2 of their own. Any attempts of the German destroyer squadron to break out of Narvik were cancelled due to the superior number of British ships. Ultimately, on the 13th of April, the battleship HMS Warspite and 9 destroyers entered the fjord. All remaining German destroyers were sunk or scuttled by their crews. Meanwhile, the Allied counterattack was getting in motion. Already on the 11th of April, troops left for Norway. On the 14th of April, a British brigade landed near Harstad, northwest of Narvik. On the 16th of April, a British brigade landed near Namsos and moved towards Trondheim. 2 days later, another British brigade landed near Andalsnes and moved towards Lillehammer. And on the 9th of April, additional French troops landed near Namsos. In overall, the Allied forces couldn't beat the Germans in central Norway, but in northern Norway around Narvik the situation was quite different. Although British troops arrived on the 14th of April in Narvik, the commander didn't press for an attack. This gave the German troops that consisted of mountain infantry, the Gebirgsjäger, and former destroyer crews the time to dig in and prepare defenses. Additionally, more Gebirgsjäger and paratroopers were flown in. Although Norwegian troops attacked several times the Germans near Narvik, those attacks were of limited success. Nevertheless, the Allies were closing in and the German commander had to shorten his lines around Narvik. Additionally, Polish and French Foreign Legion troops arrived in May, yet nearly at the same time the Battle of France began. Ultimately, the Allies captured Narvik on the 28th of May, but at this time the Battle of France was already lost. 2 days prior, Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, had begun. Similarly, in the beginning of June the Allies evacuated Narvik, yet due to the continuous attacks of the Norwegian troops the evacuation was initially unnoticed by the Germans. At about the same time the Germans started Operation Juno to bombard the Allies near Narvik. The squadron consisted of the battleship Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the cruiser Hipper and 4 destroyers. The squadron sank some transport and auxiliary vessels. Then the commander split his forces to protect the German ships, and the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau encountered the carrier HMS Glorious and her 2 escorting destroyers, which resulted in the total loss of the carrier and destroyers. Yet the Scharnhorst sustained a torpedo hit and the Gneisenau later was hit by a submarine torpedo. None of them were lost, but the number of operational ships in the Kriegsmarine was reduced even further. Now before we take a look at the losses and assessments, let's take a short look at the invasion of Denmark. The invasion of Denmark was a rather short affair. It lasted a bit less than 2 hours from the initial German attack until the surrender of the Danish government. The surprise attack caught the Danish military unprepared, who were not allowed to prepare properly in order not to provoke Germany. As a result, important airfield cities, bridges and the citadel in Copenhagen were taken easily by German troops. Seems like the approach of not offending crazy people didn't work back in 1940 neither. Now some information about the losses. As always, there's some discrepancy among the sources, so take everything with a grain of salt. The German losses in aircraft ranges from 117 to 242. In terms of men, the total loss including wounded, dead and missing was around 5,300. The losses in ships were substantial. 1 heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, 10 destroyers, 1 or 2 torpedo boats, 4 submarines. Although some sources indicate 6, I could only account for the following 4 submarines, several auxiliary vessels and 21 transport ships. Additionally, both battleships were damaged and out of action for a while, as was the panzer ship Lützow. The Allied losses were as follows: 112 aircraft, about 6,300 losses in men, this includes British, Norwegian, French and Polish troops, whereas 2,500 of them were members of the Royal Navy. 1 carrier, 2 light cruisers, 9 destroyers and 6 submarines, and several auxiliary vessels and transport. Note that the destroyers and submarines also include French and Polish losses, not just the Royal Navy. Before we move to the final assessment, let's take a short look at the surrounding events and political situation of the invasion of Norway, which is quite complicated. First, the Allies had plans to mine the Norwegian coastal areas and also to occupy the Swedish mines, with volunteer troops that were intended to support the Finnish in the Winter War. Yet due to several reasons, like the end of the Winter War, the denial of Norway and Sweden to grant access, and internal Allied complications, that plan, like many others, was never set in motion. Second, the attack started in April, and in some areas the fighting was over rather quickly, whereas in Narvik it lasted far longer. While French and Polish troops landed near Narvik to reinforce the British, the Germans were moving through the Ardennes and attacking France. Similarly, when Dunkirk was evacuated, the Allies captured Narvik in order to demolish the harbour and then evacuate in June as well. Let's try to assess Operation Weserübung on the operational and strategic level. The overall losses of the Kriegsmarine were similar to those of the Allies. Yet the major difference is that the Kriegsmarine was already a small force in 1939, whereas the Royal Navy wasn't. In other words, the Royal Navy could sustain the losses, whereas the Kriegsmarine couldn't. At the same time, the British had a dire experience. Although they possessed superior numbers at sea, the numerical advantage was limited due to the air superiority of the Luftwaffe. The operational success of the Germans was to take major ports and airfields in the beginning of the campaign, and thus they were able to successfully counter the British numerical superiority at sea. Weserübung was clearly an operational success for the Germans, but strategically it wasn't. The iron ore from Sweden lost a large amount of its importance due to the capture of Lorraine mines in the Battle of France. Even if we assume that the Germans didn't invade Norway and the British would have seized Narvik and or the Swedish mines, the question arises if the British would have been able to hold the position at all after the fall of France. Overall, the consensus seems to be that the strategic disadvantages for Germany were larger than its advantages. Although Norway provided better bases towards the Atlantic for the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe, the losses the navy sustained didn't allow it to exploit this advantage. Additionally, it needed to deploy various ships and coastal batteries to the defense of the Norwegian coast. For instance, the 15-centimeter batteries intended for the carrier Graf Zeppelin were assigned to Norway. Furthermore, the army needed to deploy a large number of troops to occupy Norway and Denmark. Another major disadvantage was that the Norwegian merchant fleet switched mostly to the Allied side, and it was one of the largest in the world. Probably the largest advantage for a German was the psychological and political impact in regards to its willingness and military abilities. The invasion of Norway clearly signaled that Germany would not allow flaky commitments to neutrality where their interests were threatened. Weserübung demonstrated Germany's ability to project strategic power, showed that no country could count on being rescued by the Allies, and earned prestige for Germany's military capabilities. Now there's one final note. The German invasion of Norway and Denmark were unopposed surprise landings with regular civilian or military vessels and not amphibious operations. Quite many people still mention Weserübung as an indication that Operation Sea Lion could have been possible. But there's a clear difference between moving ships with a few hundred men into harbors of a country that has an unmobilized army with basically no fleet, and invading the British Islands that were guarded by the Royal Navy and the British Army that had mobilized its forces several months ago. As so often, the cherry is in the details. Thank you for watching. All sources are linked in the description. If you like this video, you also might check out my video on an early war German Panzer Division or my series on the Battle of Britain. Enjoy and see you next time.